course you will. Okay. What shall we talk about now? You have a little taste of the repertoire. I'd like to tell you also a little bit about the piano. Why is the piano so important? The harpsichord, after all, had 300 years of supremacy as the prince of keyboard instruments. Well, because the needs of the world changed. The harpsichord is a plucked instrument. The piano is an instrument of inflection. It's a hammer instrument. And for at least 50 years before its invention, several people in several countries tried to create a new kind of keyboard which would do this. To us, so simple. Inflection makes you cry. You weep. Plucked instruments do not. In the 18th century, there was a tremendous new society. Not only the Industrial Revolution beginning its great sweep of the world, a middle class being born from them, but the hold of the church and polyphonic music was disappearing. Many, many new kinds of feelings. The domestic world was far more important, and there were many movements, pietist movements, there were religious movements, there were whole new aspects of sensibility. Poetry became personal, love lyrics abounded, and music had to have at home a keyboard instrument that would make you sing along or weep even. A man by the name of Cristofori right outside of Florence, the caretaker of the great Medici family's instrument collection, in his spare time wanted to make an instrument of inflection. He did. In 1790, he created this extraordinary instrument that is exactly the same as we have today. He was a genius unsung. His friend was Stradivarius. We know his name, but we do not know Cristofori's. We certainly know piano's name is named after him. He created in the next 20 years about 25 instruments. It was his hobby. He called it a harpsichord with the loud and soft. When he died, nobody cared. Violin and song was in the land of song, Italy, and nothing happened. This was not a marketing capitalism. It was, things went slowly. And these connections are what are so human, but when there is a need, things survive, and sometimes in a strange way. Well, in Germany, born 2 years before Bach, and a contemporary of Cristofori, was a man by the name of Gottfried Silbermann. He's one of the finest organ makers of his time. You can hear his Baroque organs all over Germany. And he used to hire Bach as his counselor. How does it sound in the hall? Bach was the greatest organist of his time. He'd bring Bach here, he'd bring Bach there, give him a commission, and that's how, one of the ways Bach made a living. You know, he had to make a living. You know, there's a lot of kids in that family. Well, around 1720, he was getting very frustrated. It wasn't happening. All of his experiments were not working. And one day he was in Hamburg. And I must tell you that in 1711, amazing, an article was written in a journal, a Florentine journal, a magazine that survived only 10 years. All the intellectuals in the town submitted articles, and there was an article with drawings. People drew then, and they were perfect drawings of the mechanism of the piano. 15 years later, this magazine, which was defunct, this journal, is translated to German, just as a book would be today. And by chance, Silbermann sees this journal. I don't know if he was in the dentist's office, but he saw it. He sees this, and it's like God has sent him his wish. He sees the piano, totally ready to go. Christofori had just died. Certainly wouldn't have called him long distance anyway. A very different world. He goes home and he starts building the pianos, and he builds them secretly. And when he's ready, he says to his dear friend Bach, I want you to hear this new instrument. It's a very different instrument. It's a hammer mechanism, and it's my pride and joy. Bach didn't like it. That's right. Bach is not about to change from clavichord, harpsichord, and organ. He says, it's too hard to play. The treble is weak. Well, always it will be. He doesn't like it. Now, why is it too hard to play? Detached instruments are detached. The piano needs legato, note after note. It took at least 60 years to get that touch into the vocabulary of human feeling on a keyboard. As late as 1795, when Beethoven, 35 years old, was asked about the recently deceased in 1791 Mozart, how Mozart played the piano, Beethoven said, he had heard him when he was 16 years old, oh, he played very old-fashioned in a clipped style, which tells us more than any book about how that Mozart still, being just a bit a part of the harpsichord tradition still, did not yet understand the instrument perfectly. In fact, didn't understand it as well as Clementi, the man he drew in the competition in 1781. Well, getting back to Christofori, he was mad at Bach, quite right, and I don't want to talk to him for a while. Not till 20 years later almost, in 1747, did Bach ever again play on the piano, and this is how it happened. At the court of no less than Frederick the Great, probably the greatest assembly of minds of that time, was the first son of Bach, CPE, Carl Philipp Emanuel. And he's the court composer for Frederick the Great. And Frederick one day happens to say, you know, I've never met the old Bach, as he was called, your father. But get him over here. The king will give you a ring or something. You know, I mean, you need money. It's bad. He's near blindness now. He's going to die in 3 years. He gets himself from Saxony up to Berlin, to the great palace there. And just at that time, Silbermann pulls off the most important thing in the new dissemination of the instrument. He pulls off the selling to the great king, who is a fine flutist, who composes himself, who plays every night a different new flute concerto. He pulls off the first great piano purchase in history. Frederick buys 14 pianos for the palaces in Sanssouci and Berlin. Well, Bach travels there, command performance, so to speak, sees his son, they hug. The great warrior king, very, very, very gracious to the old man, takes him around. How do you like my new pianos? And everyone is in attendance, and Silbermann is there too. Now, what does Bach say? We will never really know. For instance, let's say you buy a new piano. How dare anyone be so crass as to come in and play it and say, they don't like your new piano, knowing, of course, it's an expensive item. Bach looked up at the king. Silbermann waiting. How do you like them? Oh, they're wonderful. He improvises on a theme from Frederick the Great, goes back to Saxony, writes what we now call the musical offering, gets his jeweled ring, writes his letter of thank you note, and the piano now has a testimonial from Bach, and it was used. Next step, 7-year war. What is happening to the piano? Silbermann has now many disciples, 12 important ones. They all go to the seat of the Industrial Revolution, the greatest city of its time, the head of commerce, London itself. They're all crazy about the piano. Soon, the piano is dethroning the harpsichord. At that same court, Frederick the Great brought the most glittering intellectual energy the world has thus far seen, Voltaire himself. And it was there, because there was no pianos in France at all in the 1750s and 60s. It was there that Voltaire said the only thing he was ever wrong about. Nobody reads Voltaire, but he's a great cultural status symbol. And when Dubal wants to impress someone, knowing that they will not be impressed if I say it, I always say, and you know Voltaire said, try it, instantly the ears perk up. You listen to what Voltaire says. Voltaire, though, said, the piano, it will never dethrone the majestic harpsichord. It's an ironmonger's instrument. He was wrong. In no time, the harpsichord dies. By 1815 in France, all the harpsichords are actually used as firewood in a very, very cold winter, and they used them in firewood at the Paris Conservatory. They brought them up. We've lost all the secrets of how the French made their magnificent harpsichords. Well, the next little step is the prodigy Mozart goes to London, 8 years old. Guess who's in London? The first important pianist in history, and guess who it is? It's Bach's youngest son, who was brought there by Philip Emanuel, his half-brother. When Bach died at 15, he was, in 1750, he was 15 years old. He brings him to the court of Frederick the Great, and he learns the piano. His whole life is now not with the harpsichord, with the piano. The little Mozart idolizes Christian Bach, his gallant music, everything about him, and he says, listen to this is the piano, don't play the harpsichord anymore, and Mozart never did. And that is where it stands in Mozart's time. Then there's the Clementi contest, and the piano by 1790, when Beethoven comes to Vienna from Bonn, the piano is totally ensconced in Viennese society. Now, this is how it happened, and it took a long time. The solo recital did not happen until this. I want to talk about some of the major pianists of the time. Let me go to the piano and tell me if this is working, that you can hear me or not. Can you hear me?
Of course.
Now, Beethoven is this first emotional pianist. He's the great crossover. Now, I'm not going to necessarily play complete pieces. I want to give you as many tastes of style as possible. In the 1790s, he's still very, very gallant, but it's not harpsichord music because he already starts using his famous sforzandi. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, little angry sounds. Do that in the harpsichord. Well, it's still very classical and formal music. octaves. All the devices of classical music. By the next decade, you have the Romantic flood. You have, of course, Beethoven constantly making his music more emotional and more demanding on the piano, and indeed, the iron frame really exists because of the great and volcanic style of Beethoven. But the lyrical voice is now to be heard. Now remember, let's say a Haydn sonata. Everything is now in the triad, and everything is called the Alberti bass. That's how they got texture. It was all within a fifth. The piano has a pedal, they discover, which is the moonbeam and the whole coloristic palette which blends the thing into overtones. It's a miracle, the pedal. They say, well, you don't have to just do this. We can take the key and we can move it over here. It's still primitive. But we can put a melody with it. The inventor of the nocturne is not Chopin, but a great Irish pianist, John Field. And I want to tell you something most interesting. 2 days before I came, I got a letter from a doctor in Dallas. He read about these lectures. He had read my book, and he had also, and it's unbelievable. Unbelievable, because wherever you go, there is someone that understands and loves certain more esoteric things. And this doctor says to me in this letter, I'm going to come to your lecture because I am hoping you'll play a little nocturne by John Field. I love him dearly, and he goes on and he understands him totally, and I'll be in Dallas tomorrow, and he'll be there, and I will read this letter, and he'll be quite stunned. I know he will be there, by the way, because he was at the last one. The Field Nocturne, certainly not as great as Chopin, but you will hear, written in 1809, the first voice of subjective romanticism. The idea of the melody with the dispersed accompaniment. It's still very little compared to what Chopin or Scriabin or Rachmaninoff would do with it. He only lived 52 years. He was one of the world's most lazy creatures. He was terribly alcoholic. He was terribly immoral. He ended up in Russia because Clementi bought him from his father so he could work in his piano factory. Clementi was not only a composer, but a publisher. Remember, in about 1800, music publishing was a big deal. The Industrial Revolution and music publishing go together just as the piano is the daughter of the Industrial Revolution with its 25,000 parts. Well, Field was the worst teacher. He just fall asleep instantly during a lesson. But they loved him in St. Petersburg. He seemed so totally foreign and wonderful. And he had left Clementi, who had dragged him on the tour to sell his pianos when he was about 21, and he never left Russia except for an 8-month tour of Italy, and then finally he wound up in Paris. And the idea that Chopin had a chance to hear him was a big thing for Chopin. Liszt loved him and played nocturnes of Field. But Field, when he heard Chopin's Opus 9, the first 3 nocturnes, he said, he's a sick room talent. The music is much too morbid. Of course, he was saying something much different. He was saying, That's the end of my nocturnes. And how right he was. On his deathbed, they said, "Do you want spiritual comfort?" He said, "Well, what is that?" "Well, would you like, are you Catholic? Would you like a priest?" "No." He said, would you want to see, are you a Calvinist?" "No." He said, "I'm not that. I'm not a Calvinist. I'm a pianist." Many pianist composers. Born in 1760, and really quite an amazing composer, is Johann Ladislav Dussek. And he is the man who decided to turn the piano this way so you could see his profile. He was called Cliburn Dussek, and he wanted to make certain that everyone knew how pretty it was. So, instead of playing forward or backward, as was the case previously, he changed it, and in this case vanity worked because he found out that the music flooding out into the hall would create a better sound. Well, that's Dussek's importance. Nobody plays his music, unfortunately. It's a marvelous master, though. Czerny, born around that time. My God, everyone knows Czerny. They hate him. The bread and butter, exercises, God almighty. People that have been tortured by this very Pacific man. I mean, he's in hell now because of the thousands of exercises of torture. Goes on all summer long, all through the lawns in the suburbs, and hear this stuff going However, poor Czerny, he composed many, many other works, but only these etudes. And etudes, let's put it in a sociological context, everyone was playing the piano and buying the instrument. Yesterday in our American program, we gave some startling statistics of how vast the piano sales were among the whole population. And he was making loads of money, Czerny. He himself never cared about money. He didn't have any relationships. He just lived to compose. He was Beethoven's student. Beethoven taught him for free. He then taught Liszt for free and Leschetizky. And he left his whole fortune to a school in Vienna for deaf mutes. He was a marvelous man, and today he doesn't deserve to live in infamy. So that's Czerny of that period. Liszt said I owe him everything. Moscheles, Ignaz Moscheles from Prague, born in 1790, one of the pre-romantics. He played duets with Chopin. He was everywhere. He lived a long life. He was very scholarly and very conservative. Didn't understand the romantic pianists. You know, the full sense of romanticism was not for him. He was very conservative. Chopin said his playing is frightfully baroque. Pianists, by the way, are among the bitchiest people. You should only hear the cafeteria talk at Juilliard. It's just horrifying. By the time you leave the coffee table there, you think, my God, I'm lucky to play through one piece. You know, everyone is put down. So, Moscheles, he's of interest because he was called the Prince of Pianists. He toured everywhere. And he, in a sense, begins an international career because he takes the first train from London to Manchester. And in that sense, I see this as the beginning of the age of Europe's opening its concert corridors. We have at this period many, many interesting composers. At this time, we have a non-pianist who tried one recital unsuccessfully in his life, didn't even own a piano, but born in 1797, a little bit after Czerny and Moscheles. His name, Schubert. Schubert's song on the harpsichord. His piano accompaniments are so important to the new romantic feeling, where the musicians are now characterizing the works of the poet. And the piano is really the reason it could happen, not just the voice. Schumann, Schubert, Wolf, Brahms. In every country, the poetry was set by these composers, and the pianist played an equal part. So that's Schubert. Early 1800s, well, Schiller once said, the gods never come alone. In 1809. See, you said, oh sure, because these kind of chords and the hunting song and many other things, a new sound, but the piano music starts getting excruciatingly difficult. You can't play these octaves perfectly unless you're practicing them all day long. It becomes... So the resources of the piano, as it's getting bigger and mightier, is demanding more and more energy until today, with the Rachmaninoff third, everyone at Juilliard playing it is walking around in slings. Tendinitis is a real big problem. One kid playing the Brahms Paganini, when you hear it, you'll remember this. Japanese boy. I said, Akira, what are you doing? I'm learning the Brahms Paganini, he said. I said, what are you doing? You're killing yourself. His hand is totally in a sling. He says, I've got to learn it in 2 weeks. I said, you learn it in 2 weeks, you're a dead man. And that is exactly what happened. He didn't die, but his hands don't play as well today. To be very, very careful, these are delicate objects. The Rachmaninoff third not only demands a piano that really, really can hold up to the thousands of pounds of pressure, but these little muscles. And don't think just because, you know, the hand does not have to be muscular. That's not, there are many women in the world that play the Rachmaninoff third. They don't have to have these muscular hands. You have to be very careful not to overdo it. However, you're not playing anymore, are you? So don't worry. But the real fact is that the piano is a very dangerous object. 1810, Chopin. Now Mendelssohn is a complicated composer. You won't hear him much at the competition, I see. But his contribution to the literature is very important in the songs without words, the idea of singing. Like in the Field Nocturne, it's sing, sing, I want to sing. In a review, everyone says, oh, I had a good review. Why? Because, oh, you have a beautiful singing tone. Chopin is the ethnic composer, the one that comes from Poland, and he immortalizes the dance forms, something also new. You heard a little bit in Schubert's very simple Ländler and waltzes like that. Now the Eastern soul sings, and the nostalgia of the love for the homeland. There is no greater examples of nationalistic music than the Mazurkas of Chopin. permanent repertory of the world. Somewhere in 50 countries at this very second, some little child is practicing such innocence, such melodic magic, or a nocturne. Melodists of all time, G minor ballade. You'll hear it in the competition. The true piano bard, the poet of the piano. 1810. A little waltz. And messy version. Listen to the heartbreaking nostalgia in a melody that literally has no grounding. It is unending. And listen to, again, this ability of inflecting a melody to make it, literally molding it in thin air. Only the piano can do this. Chopin made it. Said, the moment I play Chopin, the audience sighs in relief. Same year, Schumann. He wants so much to be a pianist. He's half mad already by 20. He puts a contraption on his fourth finger. Every idiot knows that the fourth finger is attached to the third. He practices. He makes certain that he paralyzes his finger. Is this Freudian? Fortunately, he lives with his piano teacher who has a little girl by the name of Clara Schumann. And he marries the greatest woman pianist of the 19th century who promotes his piano music. He couldn't waste his time practicing 8 hours a day. So why not compose, since it was starting to pour out of him? He had no education, musically, basically speaking. 6 months of theory with Heinrich Dorn, an important teacher of the day. That was it. All of a sudden, it seemed like he willed himself to be this master. Schumann dies at 46 in the insane asylum. Clara outlives him by 45 years. She becomes Brahms' great friend. And Schumann writes, when they are separated by the father, would not permit this weird guy to marry, and you wouldn't either. So Schumann took him to court. He won the case, and then began the marriage. Schumann, before that, wrote only piano music, and then he wrote 140 songs in the year of marriage. And then they had 8 children. 1 piano. She let him compose at it. She was a born executant. He was extremely chauvinistic, couldn't bear the fact that the world knew who she was from prodigyhood on. He accompanied her occasionally, but basically Schumann was so introverted that he could go months without talking. And in the beginning, of course, it was sheer romance, and then, of course, comes reality called marriage and children. And she was wonderful. He didn't do a damn thing to help anything go. He didn't have a job, as a matter of fact, until the age of 42, when through her influence in Dusseldorf, she got him a job, this beautiful woman. When he died, she had to go on the road 4 to 5 concerts a week. We have 1,300 programs alone of her extant programs. She sometimes played 150 to 200 concerts a year, 17 grand tours of England alone. Bernard Shaw, in her later life, used to call her the professional widow, because she would always be dressed in black, and of course she was propagandizing her husband's music. She was quite an incredible woman, and she's the role model, by the way, for many amazing women pianists who have gotten short shrift in history because they were not men. And the case of possibly one of the great disseminators of the career of the pianist, Arabella Godard, we know nothing about this woman who at 16 played the Hummer Clavier in London from memory, got married, got bored with the situation, and took a 3-year tour. In that 3 years, on a British schooner, she went to India, to China, to New Zealand, to South America, to North America. She was everywhere, and she opened up the piano as no other person in the 1860s did. When she came back, she gave the first performance of any work, the Emperor Concerto, should be the Emperor Concerto, at the newly opened Prince Albert Hall in London. She was an enormously great, beautiful woman, very interesting. In the late 20th and 19th century, there was Julia Rivet King, who roamed America in 5,000 concerts. She was incredible, huge concerts. There was Sophie Mentor, Liszt's favorite pupil. There was probably one of the great pianists that ever lived. Arau told me that no one has ever equaled her octaves. He was just a young child. She didn't care about having children. She had 5 of them from 5 different marriages. And her name was Teresa Carreño. We may be giving Elvis a stamp, but Bolivia has given her a stamp. And no recordings, unfortunately. She dies in 1915. She was magnificent in every way, as a pianist, as a woman. Arau told me that he heard her in Berlin when he was just a young boy. He remembered it so perfectly, and he asked her an interesting question. Knowing he was a little child himself, knowing that she had all of these children, how do you practice, he asked Madame Carreño. And you know what? I think she had the answer that every woman pianist must take to heart. She said to the little boy, if anyone dares come in and bothers me during my practicing, I always have a revolver on the piano. And I will shoot any one of these little ones. He must have scared her around because he remembered that 50 years later. Let me play you a Schumann piece. During that separation period, again, I want to here. Listen to this melody. Nothing of a Chopin genius melody. Here. No big deal. But notice the bass, the movement of the bass, and notice in the one early fingers, not in the late ones. Notice the accompaniment figure. With this texture, another addition to the piano technique is born, and you have the melody in the right hand and the accompaniment in the right hand with a tremendous movement of the bass. Now notice also what Schumann does, which was revolutionary in expanding harmony, is creating dissonance, which is really the essence of Romanticism. Here comes it's all over the work. This creates the tension, and of course, the tension of his frustration, the burning passion of his love for this younger woman. By the way, when he composed Carnival, it's a portrait of all of his friends. He has in there the woman that he's engaged to, Estrella. Quite a passionate tune. But listen to the one he names for Clara. It's marked Passionato, and what is interesting to me is that she's only 16 when he's having these feelings. Listen to this. Like that for anyone 16. Now listen to the intermezzo.